first group of planes we're going to look at are rabbet planes, the simplest of the joiner planes that we're going to be dealing with in this video. And the first question would be, what exactly is a rabbet? Well, a rabbet is one of the most common joints used in woodworking, most common simple joints. A rabbet is basically a groove set in from the edge of a board, either along the grain or across the grain, right on the edge. So basically it's just a square, half of a groove on the edge of a board. And you see rabbets in the backs of cabinets where the back has been set in to the sides, the bottom of boxes where the bottom has been set up above the edge of the box. You see them in window frames, picture frames, anywhere where something is set in to get it out of sight of the rest of the viewer in the furniture construction. So we have a variety of planes here that represent sort of increasing complexity of rabbet planes. The very simplest of plane would be this square rabbet. The iron is square across. The throw is straight across. And if you look carefully, you can see that the iron is just a little bit wider than the width of the body. And that's important. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more in a second. Another style of rabbet is a skewed rabbet. You can see the iron is at an angle across the sole. And in fact, the throw here is conical here, and it throws shavings off to the left. And these planes are quite useful in that, being skewed, they cut at a slicing cut along the length of the groove, so it'll give a smoother cut and can be used cross grain to good advantage. Rabbet planes come in a variety of sizes, everything up from even narrower than this to way wider than this. Here's a sort of a wider 1.25 inch rabbet plane. They also sometimes come with something called a nicker. And a nicker allows this plane to work more efficiently across the grain. It's not only got the skewed cutter here, which is good across grain, but it's got this nicker which cuts the wood fibers ahead of the cutter. So cross grain works very well. And we're going to talk in more detail about nickers because there's a lot of nuance to the use and sharpening of nickers. So what are the important things to look for on a rabbet plane? If you think about it, the rabbet plane is practically cut in half with this mortise right here. It's sawn all the way through. So really, two parts of this plane body can move separately from each other, and it's not uncommon that when you look down the sole, you can see one side has been warped away from the other side. And what that really means is you have to straighten that plane out before you can go any further on it. So that's a very important thing to look for, that it's straight down. It's an easily solved problem because there are no fixed width to a rabbet. So you can plane down the sides, you can plane down the sole and get it all square again and so on and so forth, and it'll be just fine. And then, of course, you would grind down the iron to match the width of the sole. But that's all very straightforward, and we'll do that just a little bit later on in this video. Another thing to check is that make sure it's actually got an appropriate iron for the plane, and that the iron is actually wide enough to match the sole, a little bit wider than the sole. Often people will just stick any old iron there they possibly can. Skewed irons the same way. A little bit harder to measure how wide this iron is relative to the sole because the width of the iron is from this corner to that corner, but it's not straight across. It's sort of an angle there, so you have to sort of take careful measurements to make sure. If you look down the sole, you can tell that the iron is peeking out just a little bit on each side, and that's important. With nickers, irons planes with nickers, there are, as I said before, we're going to talk about nickers in detail, but you want to make sure the nicker is flush to the sole here and sticks out just as much as the iron sticks out from the side of the plane. So you can see there's only one nicker on this plane. It's designed that way. So it's really designed for cutting on this side of a rabbet. In other words, cutting this way, not around back the other way. And of course it's skewed that way, so it's skewed in the angle that's meant to be cut like that. And this nicker then is just on that one side. It's not too common to find rabbets like this with a nicker, but it can be quite useful. Beyond these wooden planes, we have a variety of metal rabbet planes. And Stanley was quite inventive with for their rabbets. Here's a plane that's called a number 10. It's just a number in Stanley's numbering system. And you can see that it's a rabbet plane because rabbet planes always have the iron full across the width of the sole of the plane. And you can see that's the case here. And in other aspects, it's just exactly like a bench plane. It's got a cap iron here. It's got a chip breaker, and it's got the iron. Take a look at this iron. The iron the cutting part of the iron is very short, just that long. In fact, it can only be as long as the distance from there to there. So typically the irons are quite short in that respect. So being a rabbet plane, they're reground quite often because the corners need to be sharp. As long as the corners are sharp, it can cut right into the corner of a rabbet and get a nice sharp shoulder. Therefore, these planes, you often find these planes severely ground back during the lifetime of their use. Other aspects of a bench plane that's common to this plane here: a lateral adjust to square the iron relative to the body, a screw adjust to advance or retract the iron, a frog that can be moved forward and back to change the width of the mouth. So pretty straightforward. One of the things, the most important thing to look for in metal rabbets is that the cheeks here, this cheek here or this cheek here, the plane has not been dropped and the cheek cracked. You often, and it's amazing, that you see these planes where they've been broken here and welded back together again. Very difficult to get the two parts of the sole back in the same plane when it's broken off like that. So I would stay away from planes where there's an obvious weld mark right there. The other things you might look for are, is the handle intact? Is the knob intact, or are there any cracks in or anything like that? But other than that, you look for the same things as with bench planes: flat sole, iron the full width of the plane, and so on and so forth. As I mentioned, it's a little bit hard to sharpen these irons. You can see what the problem is immediately. You can't put a square across here to make sure that the iron is square across here. So it requires a little finagling to get this part square to the axis of the iron. And we'll talk about sharpening rabbet planes in just a little while, and I think that will exemplify many of the issues here. There's one last rabbet plane I wanted to show you. Stanley made a series of rabbet planes, the 180 series and the 190 series, which are basically rabbets. You can see that here, square across, blade goes all the way across, and no adjustment mechanism for the iron. It's all manual. No lateral adjustment, so they're very, very simple rabbets. And they often came with a depth stop. You can see this one's missing that depth stop. That's the track that the depth stop would move in. And that hole right there is the screw adjust to hold the depth stop down. They had no fence. They had no nicker, a depth stop, and they cut a rabbet of different widths depending on which one member of the series they were. This one's sort of needed some serious refurbishing, but you can often find these planes floating around. I think the 190 series may have had knickers and the 180 series didn't. I can't quite remember. But there are 3 in each of the series, and they're quite useful as rabbet planes also. So that's sort of overview of the different types of rabbets and some of the issues that you might be looking for if you're thinking about buying a rabbet. And let me just say, rabbets are among the cheapest planes and probably the least valued, but in many ways, least valued monetarily, but most valuable in terms of the job that they actually do. A very workmanlike plane. We're going to cut a few rabbets here and with different rabbet planes, see what kind of different effects we get. But I'm going to adjust this iron here first in this plane as a demonstration. These planes are already set up. This one's not been set up. I'm going to remove the iron, striking it flat on the nose to loosen the wedge. Bring the iron out. I'm going to advance the iron so that it's, pull back the iron so it's definitely shy of the sole. Put the wedge in, center it with my fingers side to side. Want to make sure it's definitely shy of the sole at this point. Tap in the wedge and seat that snugly. I'm going to look down the length and see that if my iron is projecting right or left. If it is, I might strike it up here. Every time I hit the iron, I'm going to hit the wedge. Make sure that I haven't loosened it. And then I'm going to start advancing the iron with my finger on the iron here so I can feel what's going on. As I said, I hit the iron, hit the wedge, give a pass, no go. Another pass, no go. Eventually, we'll get there. And if I feel my iron biting on one side here, so I can cut a shoulder up there, I'll take a look, make sure it's not sticking too far out on the cutting side. If it is, I might tap it in just a wee bit. Try and snug that up just a little bit better. And then I'm happy with it. If I need to retract the iron, if I've made it just a little bit heavy, and I want to come back just a wee bit, I can give it a light tap here. Snug the wedge up again. And you see I've gotten a much finer shaving. Check again for the orientation of the iron here. Make sure that it's centered as well as I want it to be. The iron will move around as you fiddle with it. And you want to just keep doing this until you get a nice smooth shaving, the iron's in the right spot, then you're ready to move forward and start cutting a rabbit. We'll put this plane aside because I've set these the way I want them to be. I've got a board here. I've laid out some 3/8 inch wide rabbets on 3 edges, 3/8 inch deep, all the way around. And we're going to use this board to use those 3 different planes. I've got 2 kinds of rabbets. A skewed iron rabbet and a square crossed rabbet. And then I have a rabbet that's skewed and it has a nicker. So we're going to establish this first rabbit with these 2 planes here. Skewed iron rabbits tend to want to always pull towards the point right there. They want to pull in this direction like that. So to start a rabbit, it's a little bit risky because it'll want to slip across my gauge line. So I'm going to start the rabbit using the square crossed iron. And the other thing I'm going to do is, my practice is always to start shy of the line. I've got a gauge line here, but that's my final line. I'm going to start shy or inside that line, work my way down to this line here, then come back and clean it up this way and get it square to this line here, square to that new shoulder. So that's the process here. We'll use a combination of these 2 planes. Once I've got a shoulder established, I'll start using this one as well. This one, although it's skewed, gives a finer cut, a more slicing cut. So the quality of surface will be better, but it's harder to start with this, so that's why I'm starting with this one here. I'm using my fingers as a fence, resting against the bottom of the plane, my thumb here to help me guide the plane at an angle, and I'm going to run a small line carefully down shy of my shoulder and try and follow this until I've got a shoulder. And once I got a definite shoulder to work against, I'm going to start straightening up the plane so I'm cutting straight down. And what I may do is come by and straighten up the shoulder here just a little bit. And get a little bit closer to this gauge line. One thing about doing rabbets is it's real easy to have the rabbet tip over like this. So you want to focus on looking straight down the plane and keeping it vertical as you work through the... And then as you get close to the other gauge line down here, you want to start thinking about trying to keep the line coming down evenly all the way along. Let's use this other plane here just a little bit. I'm actually going against the grain here, so just a little bit, so cut's a little bit heavy. And I'm checking quite often, keep things square. And when I get down to the gauge line here, you can see that the gauge line has knifed in, and there's the last shaving right up here, and there's the knife line from the marking gauge right there. So one more cut will bring me right down to the gauge line. A little more back there. And now I'll come back and I'll clean up this shoulder. Let's use this skew plane to clean up this shoulder. Find the best direction to go on the grain here. So this kind of plane here, I would say, is best used for blocking out a rabbet joint that's not necessarily going to be a visible joint, like a number 3 cut or number 2 cut. A number 1 cut, a very smooth, square, and even cut, might be used with a different plane, and we'll talk about some of those later on. Let me switch this around, and let's do a cross-grain cut that's been gauged already with these 2 planes and see what kind of surface we get with those right there. So let me just reverse this in the vise here. This will be a little bit of an experiment because we have a plane with a nicker here, which will be the solution to that, but no nicker on these rabbets at all. We're going to cut right up to that gauge line and see what happens. You can see the kind of cut we're getting across the grain here. We're just rolling up fibers. So we are getting an edge here, but it's a rough edge right here. Let's see if we can clean that up this way. This will be going against the grain here, all end grain this way. So it's a little bit tough to push this plane through there like that. So not exactly the very best plane to do that with. Let's take it down to this line and switch the other side here. And we'll try the skew plane on this other edge right here. See how that works. Again, a skewed cutter. It's cutting into this line here. We'll try and start out right on the gauge line. And I don't know if you can hear or not, but already we're getting a way different sound. And can you see the difference in quality of surface? So skewed iron, cross grain. Need to clear out my shavings a little more carefully than that. So you can see a skewed iron is going to give us a better cut here and a cleaner shoulder right here across the grain. Right there. We are going to get tear out here, so this is need to be able to take that into account for cutting a rabbet all the way around the board. Let's do one more cut here with the skewed iron and the nicker and just see how that looks. And let me just take a minute to set that cut up, and then we'll come right back. So I've reset this into the board, cleaned it up so we can try this same cross grain cut with a rabbet plane with a nicker in it. And if you look carefully, you can see the nicker, the cutter right there. I've got that cutter advanced. We just give it a slight tap, make sure it's snug down in there. And the iron is even with the nicker as best I can determine. So we'll go ahead and make this first cut right on the gauge line. And you can see we're actually getting cross-grain shavings here. The sound is much better and the quality of the cut is much better. We're just one shaving north of the line, right up to there, a little bit more right there. So I'll just give one pass at the end. And there the scribe line shows through all the way, so one last pass here. Right to the line, a little bit right there. And there we are. A very nice end grain cut. a very smooth cross grain cut here. Rabbet plane skewed with the nicker.
If you're interested in learning traditional woodworking with hand tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find free video tutorials, buying guides, and reviews. Make sure you subscribe to my regular blog posts and also check out my 10 steps for getting started. Enjoy!